Matt Zwolinski, it's very nice to have you here. It's nice to see you. We last met in San Diego.
Yeah, it's great to see you again, Jeff. We were hanging out at Libertopia.
I know, right? And we sort of hit it off. We had a really nice lunch and argued and agreed, and it was fun.
It was amazing. Yeah, it was
Yeah,
a
it was
great
good.
experience for me. I've been looking forward to meeting you for a long time. So
Well,
it's good
and
to follow up.
I you too. I mean, you have a very intense interest in libertarianism as a political philosophy and a kind of worldview, and you kind of made it your professional sort of gig in a way, and you have a book in preparation.
Yeah, it's nice how that worked out. When I was in graduate school, it was still a really big thing that people sort of talked about in the libertarian academic circles about whether you should sort of come out with your libertarianism or whether it was something you should try to hide and keep a secret from your colleagues so that you could, really advance your career by doing something more intellectually respectable, I guess. And I don't know, I never really did that. I mean, for a while, I guess it wasn't the centerpiece of my academic interest as it is now. I've found that the more I've made my academic interest focus on what I'm just really genuinely interested in, which is all these neat, interesting, fascinating, crazy libertarian ideas, the more it's worked out for me. So it's been really an amazing
Well,
experience.
actually, you raise a very interesting topic. It is a problem that every graduate student faces. Everyone has his or her own sort of intense interest in something, right? But then
Yeah.
sometimes you feel like, well, the academic life isn't only about following my interests around and my idiosyncratic, sort of loves. I have to do something that's professionally viable. It just so happens that those coincided for you, and that's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and it is true that you can't just do whatever you happen to be interested in. But I think a lot of times, when you're really genuinely interested in something, that shows through in your work. I mean, you you come up with angles on the stuff that other people might not. Or you convey an enthusiasm and passion for the ideas, and that by itself goes a long way, even in the sterile world of academics.
Yeah, and academia needs specialists in idiosyncratic areas. I remember a friend of mine who got interested in the liturgy of Greek Orthodoxy, and it was like all he cared about. I thought this is the most boring subject in the world, and you're probably the only person who knows about this stuff. But he was a philosopher, and he
Yeah.
was able to match these things. It turns out now within I guess in the world of political and moral philosophy, he is considered the great expert on the topic of the liturgy of Greek Orthodoxy. So I guess it works out sometimes.
Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does. But I mean, one thing that academics don't do enough, I think, is think about themselves as entrepreneurs and think
Mm.
about themselves as producing a product that other people are going to consume. So you do have to take into account what you're good at and what you have a passion for. It matches up in certain ways with what you're good at, but you also have to think about what people want to read, what people are interested in, and allow that to shape the work that you produce, just like in any other business.
I'm very optimistic about your book as a consumer product. I mean, you were so gracious to send me a draft of probably it seems like about two-thirds of it is finished now, and
Yeah, yeah.
I just devoured it because I mean it's something I really care about. Also, I think you add a different perspective than I've read before, and it's extremely enlightening. I suppose you had to kind of take into consideration what else was already written and figure out how yours would fit into that into this niche market. Was that something you were thinking about, or did that so you just sort of naturally able to add this value?
Uh, it's funny. We didn't have to think about that as much as we might have thought that we would have to think about it, just because there isn't really any academic book that tries to give a kind of systematic history of libertarian thought in the way that we wanted to do, right? Sort of going back beyond the 1940s Rand Patterson era, right, to some of the earlier precursors of libertarian thought. And nobody was doing that. You got Brian Doherty's great book, which is a wonderful history of the libertarian movement in the United States, but that's a very different kind of thing from the sort of intellectual history that John Tomasi and I are trying to produce in our books. So we really felt lucky to kind of stumble into this project where the field was really wide open for us to do whatever we wanted to do.
And this is precisely what I love about your book the most. It stops treating libertarianism as something that was just sort of born, out of nothing, in response to the New Deal, and starts to treat it as a long intellectual tradition. You mentioned a book, I think it came out in was it 1912, 1915, something like that, called Liberty and the Great Libertarians by.
Yeah.
The name is
Charles Sprading.
Sprading, right. And I remember when I bumped into that book for the first time, I just had the sudden scary thought that, oh my goodness, there's a huge prehistory here about which I know nothing. And so you sort of dug way back and examined this as a self-conscious tradition. And I think that helps situate modern libertarians as part of a long range of thought. I mean, we are, after all, not invented, just immediately. We all grow out of a sort of a cultural firmament that already exists, and I think it gives you a different perspective on what libertarianism is. Do you want to go into that?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, you get. I think you get a certain kind of myopia among both libertarians, which is one of the audiences that we want to speak to with this book, right? We want to talk to sort of people who aren't academics necessarily, but have an interest in libertarianism, and then we also want to speak to our fellow academic philosophers who aren't libertarians but have an interest in political theory, and both of those groups are myopic about the way they think about libertarianism, though in kind of different ways. So among academics, essentially the first and only libertarian book that they recognize, the first libertarian thinker that they recognize, is Robert Nozick with Anarchy, State, and Utopia, right. Which is odd because if you read just the preface of Nozick, he talks about his indebtedness to people like Murray Rothbard and how conversations in Murray's living room were what initially interested him in the ideas that went on to become the foundation of that book. But most academic philosophers never look past Nozick. That is, libertarianism was born and died with Robert Nozick in most of their eyes. And then for movement libertarians, it goes a little further back. I mean, so movement libertarians know about Rothbard, they know about Rand, but for most of them, it doesn't go back much further than that. And so we wanted to push the envelope a little bit and see where these ideas came from. And some of them are names that are familiar to a lot of libertarians. Like, a lot of people know who Benjamin Tucker was. They've heard the name of Herbert Spencer or Auburn Herbert, people like that. But most people don't read those guys and don't really know the details of their ideas or how they influenced each other or how they all kind of fit together with the things that we think libertarians believe today. So it's just been a lot of fun.
Well, the other thing I've noticed, even in reading post-war libertarian writers, like whether it's Mises or Leonard Read or Rothbard or Rand or any of them, what you find is in fact a big diversity of thought on fundamental subjects like property and ownership, the role of the state, what rights are and how they're expressed in the real world, the role of the common law, and so on. So everything. There's a huge range of thought. And it's fascinating to discover this, and then you wonder, well, why then is movement libertarianism so sort of narrowly constrained, and why are libertarians so caricatured in their views of the world by academic mainstream? And I think this is a beautiful thing about your book, is you show that this diversity is not only present now, but it's always been there.
Yeah, yeah, and we've been having the same debates for the last at least 100 years or so. I mean, libertarians have been arguing about anarchism versus minarchism, or whether some kind of radical opposition to the status quo is the best way to change things, or whether you want to infiltrate mainstream organizations and change them from the inside. Like we all have these debates, right? You have
Right.
had them, I've had them, and we all have them like it's the first time that anybody has ever talked about these ideas. And but people have been doing this ever since, and not just in libertarians. It's any kind of radical political group. I mean, a lot of these debates are particular to libertarianism. They're debates that any group of people that envisions a society that is radically different from the form of society that we currently live in faces a lot of the same kinds of strategic and philosophical questions about the morality or the wisdom of participating in the society that you object to. So you can learn a lot from you can learn a lot, like, what were the ideas that they had, and it also puts it in a certain kind of perspective, like, it sort of relieves you of the burden of thinking like, I'm going to solve all this by myself, right? Like,
Exactly.
there's a kind of hubris to that thought when
There
we
is.
step back and you look at the length of time and the quality of the minds that have been participating in this debate for such a period of time.
Right. I mean, this struck me. I think you and I talked about this over lunch, but even Mises's own conception of where property comes from and what it consists in and its moral status is like radically, wildly different from the Lockean, Randian, Rothbardian tradition. And just to sort of encounter that is a
Yeah.
little bit of a mind-blowing experience. It's like, well, maybe we don't have it all worked out. Maybe there's more to think about. But let me ask you this. So, I mean, I can't even imagine the joy you must feel day to day digging through all this great material and everything.
So fun.
Um, do you find yourself pulled in various directions as a thinker as you encounter these guys?
All the time, all the time. I don't understand people who have their minds made up about all of this stuff, because it's so hard, and the issues are so complicated to me, and these people make really persuasive cases, and so I find myself all the time, like, I'll read one person on one side of an argument, and I'll just I'll immerse myself for a month in kind of Hayekian classical liberalism, and I'll really feel the pull of that. And now in January, my big task is I'm writing the chapter on anarchism. So I'm digging through all these really fascinating anarchist theorists from the late 19th and early 20th century. And boy, man, I'm really feeling the pull now. Like this, it's an attractive ideal, and just the arguments are great. There's some really good arguments for anarchism that you find, in people like Lysander Spooner and some of the abolitionists. But just I think some of it's aesthetic, right? Some of it's just the beauty of the vision that they spell out, and the poetry. Oh, they're almost the poetry of their philosophy, almost, right? I mean, it's just you wanna believe in it because it's such an inspiring
Yeah.
idea.
Well, let me ask you this, Todd. Do you remember if there was a time in your life when you kind of made a commitment to the idea of human liberty, like that it became so romantically attached to your heart and soul that it wouldn't dislodge itself?
Yeah, for sure. For sure, absolutely. Yeah, I was a sophomore in college, and I was majoring in computer science at the time. Actually, I was a mathematics computer science major, and I don't know how this came up, but I had a friend in one of my calculus classes, I think, who we talked about ideas, different kinds of politics and just whatever. And one day he handed me a copy of The Fountainhead, and he said, "You got to read this." And I said, "Okay." So I went and read it, and that was it. Like, that was a beautiful book. I still love that book. And
Well, can I ask you in particular about that? Because I'm embarrassed to say that The Fountainhead didn't really do it for me, right? And I'm kind of devoted to Rand, and I just
yeah.
the Fountain. I mean, what was it about the Fountainhead that gripped you the most? I mean, surely not, I mean, that book is all about intellectual property, for example, and
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's other annoying, for me anyway, things about the book that bother me. What was
Sure.
it that stood out for you the most?
I mean, so I've always thought of the Fountainhead as first and foremost a book about individualism,
Mm.
and in a sense, it's not really a libertarian book in the way that Atlas Shrugged is, right? Like it's not, it doesn't wear its libertarianism on its sleeve,
Mm.
because it's not really about politics. It's about integrity, and being true to oneself in the face of pressures to conform, resistance from others, and I found that really attractive. I was like a lot of libertarians. I think I was never one that really fit well into social groups in high school and things like that. And so I always kind of saw myself as on the outside looking in certain ways. And so here was this author presenting that as a virtue, as something to be proud of,
And at a
I guess
time when the whole world was about the collective, right? Everything.
yeah.
This comes out what, like immediately following World War II? Am I right about that, or during the World War II,
Yeah,
something like that?
yeah, that's right.
So big aggregates and wars and collectives and
Right,
groupthink
right.
is all the rage. It's in the corporate world, it's in the public schools, it's in public policy, and then this one woman comes along and says, "Look, the individual actually matters." I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of amazing.
Yeah, yeah. So it really wasn't about the politics at all for me at first. It was just, I think it was about the idea of individualism, the idea of being true to yourself, of integrating, right, all components of your life together. Like your work should be an expression of your character, of your personality in some ways. I thought that was all for somebody who's going through that period of life where you're trying to decide, like, what am I going to be? What is my life going to look like? I
Right.
think that was a really powerful message, and I think it's one that's always resonated with people that age and probably always
So
will.
you fell in love with the idea of human liberty, but let me ask you this, because it sort of impacts on me personally. Yeah, I had a similar thing. I fell in love with this dream of human liberty. But as the years have gone on, I find subtle shifts in my own understanding of why I love liberty, or what
Yeah.
I find most compelling about it. Like as the years have gone on, that I have answered that question differently. Um,
Right.
has that happened to you, and is it still happening to you?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I mean, after I started reading the Fountainhead, I went on and read almost all of Rand's other stuff, or other fiction, all of her nonfiction. I started my student club. I became a very devoted student of objectivism, as we called ourselves in those days. And I thought that, at the time, I thought that Rand's answer to this question of why human liberty was the correct one, right? And I don't anymore. And yet I still maintain the ideal in some way, right? Like I don't. The contours have shifted somewhat, right? So I don't
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that Rand's vision of an ideally just society and mine are exactly the same, but they're pretty broadly the same. We agree probably on more stuff than we disagree about. But yeah, I mean the foundation, the why, the what it is that's attractive about freedom, that's certainly changed over
It
time.
changes. Yeah.
I've come to think, sometimes I think, mostly in terms of, I went through a phase where I was reading a lot of economics, right? And so there it was kind of utilitarian sort of cost benefit analysis type stuff that was really central to my thinking. And then, I studied with some people who were doing ancient Greek virtue ethics when I was at Arizona, and there, I came to see things more in terms of the lens of human virtue and human flourishing. It evolves, and yet the vision doesn't change, which makes you question the rationality of this whole project, right? It's like you're committed to this idea, and then you just go looking for reasons to believe the idea that you're already
I
committed
know
to.
exactly what you mean. It's funny how the one thing can be absolutely secure, this attachment to liberty, but the reasons why can sort of migrate around. And I wonder if That's just simply because human liberty is such a big idea that there are many ways to get into it and to approach it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah, I think to a lot of extent the libertarians spend more, especially those libertarians who are kind of academically inclined, spend more time than they ought to thinking about those sort of base level fundamental questions, when in the end they don't always matter so much, right? I mean, you know, all of these different bases by and large get you to the same result, and so if you spend it less time, you know, focusing on the disagreements among those foundations, and more time thinking about that result and how to actually get from here to there, that might be a more useful expenditure of intellectual horsepower.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of the old scholastic vision. You know, one of the reasons that the scholastics were so sort of intellectually reckless and wandering all over the place is this conviction of the unity of all truth. Like, we may not know all the particulars of why everything fits together, but we can have a conviction, you know, that ultimately they do somehow.
Right.
And I caught some of that in your book. You know, a real sort of sweep and a broadness of mind. You also try to keep your own perspective out of there. I mean, it's not an argumentative book in any way. It's more expository, really.
Yeah, and that's something that we have been pretty self-conscious about in writing the book. So, you know, both John and I have a particular way of thinking about, you know, libertarianism and what the best form of libertarianism is, and what the best foundation for it is, and what kinds of particular, you know, kind of public policy outcomes, you know, kind of attached with that. But we didn't want the book to be an argument about that. We didn't want it to be like, you know, this is why you should all be bleeding heart libertarians or something. We want it to be just an honest history of libertarianism with you know, with the bleeding heart elements, which we think are there in the history, right? Like, you can find, I think, elements in libertarian thought that have a lot of common with the kinds of ideas that both John and I are really attracted to in libertarianism, but also with the non-bleeding heart stuff, you know.
But by bleeding heart, we should just clarify. I mean, you don't mean, oh, welfare state is great, or something like that. What you really mean is a broad concern for social flourishing among all groups and classes, and particularly with reference to underprivileged, which is certainly a theme that you find in libertarianism that hasn't gone away. I mean, it's there and you know, everywhere you look. Am I right about that?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. In fact, I think if I had to rename the brand now, if I was starting from scratch, I might go with your humanitarianism, because I like that better. I think it's more accurate. Maybe not as catchy as a marketing gimmick, but I think that's the right idea. It's humanitarianism, right? I mean, you're concerned with human well-being.
That's right. You know, it's funny when I wrote that brutalism versus humanitarianism article, I hadn't anticipated that brutalism is a much cooler word than humanitarianism.
Yeah.
It's like, you kind of want to be a brutalist, but you don't really want to be a humanitarian.
Yeah, humanitarian sounds boring. Sounds like UNICEF or something.
But you know, I was digging through. I'm sure Frank Chodoroff is going to play a significant role in your book here. But he embraces that term, actually. It's throughout his work, humanitarianism, as a kind of almost a synonym for his vision of the perfectly free society.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think he's going to play more of a role in the anarchism chapter in the second half that I haven't quite written yet. But yeah, we don't actually discuss him as much as we should. I mean, that's the thing with a book like this, is there's so many amazing figures, and you want to touch on them all, but you just can't. Or if you do, then you end up not being able to say enough about any one of them to really give people some meat to chew on. But Chodoroff's amazing. He's just both as a thinker and as a kind of movement guy. He's such an extraordinary character.
Yeah, so underrated in so many ways. I'm sure a part of you was reluctant to take on a project that would be so big like this, but you seem to be making progress. I mean, when you first told me the scope of the project, I was a little skeptical. I thought, well, how can you do that? But going through the book, I mean, it's a disciplined and erudite work so far.
No, thank you, Jeff. Thanks. That means a lot coming from you. I appreciate hearing that. It's been a challenge, but like you said, I mean, it's just been a joy at the same
Yes.
time. I mean, so much that the joy itself is a kind of challenge, right? Because it's like you could just keep doing this forever and never actually finish the book because it's so much fun to research and write about.
Well,
this
it's
stuff.
fun when you read a book in draft and you're thinking the whole time, I want this to be in print so that I can have it on hand and so that I can share it with friends. And I had that feeling as I was reading the book. Well, let me ask you to return just quickly to this whole question of why liberty. Do you ask yourself right now, like at your current stage of intellectual development after all the research, like if you were going to, somebody was going to press you and say, Todd, why do you believe in liberty? What is the strongest possible case you can make for it? Would you be able to answer that question?
Oh gosh, not briefly, probably, but I'm a philosopher. I'm a philosopher, so I have a hard time answering any question briefly, I guess. I think the if I tried to answer it briefly, right, the short answer is because I believe liberty is conducive to human flourishing, right? And then spelling that out is inevitably going to require saying a lot more, right? But I mean, I think if you look at human history, right, and the ways in which different societies have worked, and the ways in which human beings had the opportunity open to them to live happy and peaceful and flourishing lives, I think you see kind of empirically a strong connection between human freedom and human flourishing. And then if you step back and reflect philosophically on why that's the case, right? Like why do we see that connection? I think you can make a really compelling theoretical case, right, about the way in which spontaneous orders work to produce a kind of peaceful social order in the way that top-down orders don't, or the way that human autonomy needs room to sort of express itself in society. So it's not just this sort of bare empirical fact out there, like, oh look, hey, free societies tend to be happy, tend to be wealthy. I think you can explain why that's the case, why that's not a mistake, and why you should expect that to continue in the future. So I don't know, it's a kind of a mix of Misesian a priorism, right? Like you can construct a theoretical argument as to why this ought to be the case. But I think if that's all you had, like if you didn't actually have the facts,
Right.
I don't know that I would be satisfied with that kind of a priorism. I want to look at the numbers too.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned Mises. One of the things you find from Mises, Matt, I'm sure as you know, is that Mises heavily relies on an empirical argument. I mean, in his public lectures, in his public writings, he's always going back to the fact that, look, liberalism saved us. Liberalism lengthened lives. Liberalism lifted us up out of the state of nature. So that aphorism that you mentioned becomes very important for making his arguments concerning pure economic theory. But when it comes to persuading people of freedom,
Right.
he's all over.
That's right.
Experience.
That's right. And I think, if people read theory and history, right, you get a really nice explanation in that book of how those two elements are supposed to fit together and what the proper role of theory is relative to history. I mean, I think it's an underread book, but it's all in there.
I know. Yeah, I love rereading that book, and every time I reread it, I'm sure that you have reread a number of books that you've already read in preparation for this project. Do you find that same thing happens to you, that you pick up an old book that you thought you knew really well, and it's like completely fresh, and you're startled at how much you missed the first time?
Yeah, that happens, right? Like I'll find new ideas in a book that because my interests have changed, right? And so something that I would have skimmed over the first time now really stands out to me as of central importance.
Right.
And then sometimes I'll go back to books that I was really, really taken with and impressed by some earlier reading, and I'll pick it up and I'll go, like, what? why did I ever find this persuasive, right? Like, this is doesn't have the same pull on me as it used to
Do you ever have the experience of reading something the first time and thinking it's a little low level, like, yeah, I already know this stuff, and then going back to it again later and going, oh, this is actually brilliant. I wasn't giving it a fair reading the first time.
And you know who I had that experience with all the time? Friedrich Bastiat, right? Because he's such a beautiful writer, right? He's so clear that, I mean, it's in a sense, it's like Plato, right? When I assign Plato to my students, they skim over it because it reads like a play, and they think, oh, I'm just reading some little chatty dialogue between two kids like in a play. And they miss the real depth and the sophistication of the ideas. And Bastiat's the same way because he's such a beautiful writer. It's easy to just kind of let your eyes sort of move over the words, and yeah, you get the kind of basic idea, but you miss the subtleties. And there's a lot of subtlety in Bastiat compared to what
yeah, just an essay like The Law. I think I've probably read it 30 times, and most recent time I read it, I felt like I had never read it before. I was just blown away by. I thought, oh my goodness, all truth is in this one.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic, and the harmonies are terrific. Nobody reads the harmonies, but the harmonies are beautiful, and a really, really great book. Really great book.
When can we, Matt? When can we expect the book to come out? Are we looking at 2015? You think?
Come out, I think it's probably going to be early 2016. So right now we've got 2 real chapters left to finish. I'm writing the one on anarchism, and then John's writing a really exciting chapter on libertarian international views, basically, right? Like, so talking about libertarian views on peace and free trade and free migration. A lot of stuff on Richard Cobden in there, who is just, what a beautiful man, what a beautiful human being, and an amazing bit of history that story is. So we're trying to finish those chapters up this month, and then it's going to go through a really long, I think, review process. We're going to have to do some revisions because there's, John and I are just 2 people. I'm sure we've missed a whole lot of stuff that needs to go in there. So all of that hopefully will get kind of hammered in over the review process, and then I think, yeah, probably early 2016.
Well, you're a dangerous friend and intellectual because I could talk to you all day. But I want to ask you one last question before we end. Sometimes in the course of doing these research like this, you run across an insight that just shocks you, and you just want to shout it from the rooftops. Has anything like that happened to you yet?
I think it probably happens so regularly to me that I'm having trouble picking just one instance. But I think the most fascinating insight I had, at least recently, came from reading Herbert Spencer and his discussion of property. So he's got this chapter in Social Statics on the right to the use of the earth, where he's talking about property and land and what, if anything, can justify property and land. And he anticipates these arguments that have become sort of mainstream in academic political philosophy in the last 30 or so years or so, but he makes them all against the Lockean view of property. So you think, people think Herbert Spencer, oh, he's a Lockean, right? He's a free market, private property, social Darwinist kind of guy, right? So he and Locke must be tight on this issue of property rights, and he takes Locke to task, and well, I mean, so he says, look, Locke, like you say, property rights are justified if people go out and they mix their labor with them, right? And then they go on and they peacefully trade with each other. He says, where on earth has this ever happened, right? He says, if you look at how property rights actually came about, it's through conquest and bloodshed, right? It's not through labor mixing. So if you're going to appeal to this Lockean story to justify actually existing property rights, it simply doesn't work because that's not the way they actually came about. You read that and you're like, yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and Mises says the exact same thing, and
yeah,
it's yeah. Well, I mean, I don't need to tell you that I've become increasingly suspicious of the Lockean story myself. It's just too abstract and too purely conjectural. And well, I think the really important thing is that there are other traditions of thought here. besides just the locking.
Yeah. And there's other elements in Locke too, right? I mean, it's the labor mixing stuff is the thing in Locke that everybody focuses on, but Locke has a lot of stuff in there about how property and land makes human lives better, right? It increases the productivity of land, so that, like, it might seem like if I fence in a piece of property and say you can't use that anymore, Jeff, sorry, it's mine now, that I'm taking something away from you, I'm making you worse off, I'm harming you. But in fact, Locke says I'm actually benefiting you, because once I fence that land in, I can use it, I can develop it without fear that somebody else is going to come around and take the produce of my labor. And yeah, that makes me better off, but that makes you better off too, because then we can trade, right? And that's where the magic happens.
Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah. Well, I look forward to hearing at the end of this project about your final conversion to anarchism.
Yeah, give me another 3 weeks as I finish with this chapter. We'll see. We'll see.
In any case, I can't wait.
Carl Hess, man.
And it's been a pleasure again getting to know you, counting you as a friend, and hanging out with you today. And thanks so much for spending the time with us. Okay.
No, it's a joy. It's an absolute joy. Thanks, Jeff.
And people can go to your blog, Matt Zwolinski, at Bleeding Heart Libertarians, and also take your classes at the University of San Diego, you said. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you again. Take care, my friend.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay.
It was a lot of fun. Bye.
Matt Zwolinski, it's very nice to have you here. It's nice to see you. We last met in San Diego.
Yeah, it's great to see you again, Jeff. We were hanging out at Libertopia.
I know, right? And we sort of hit it off. We had a really nice lunch and argued and agreed, and it was fun.
It was amazing. Yeah, it was a great experience for me. I've been looking forward to meeting you for a long time. So
well, and you too. I mean, you have a very intense interest in libertarianism as a political philosophy and a kind of a worldview, and you kind of made it your professional sort of gig in a way, and you have a book in preparation.
Yeah, it's nice how that worked out. When I was in graduate school, it was still a really big thing that people sort of talked about in the libertarian academic circles, about whether you should sort of come out with your libertarianism or whether it was something you should try to hide and keep a secret from your colleagues, so that you could really advance your career by doing something more intellectually respectable, I guess. And I don't know, I never really did that. I mean, for a while, I guess it wasn't the centerpiece of my academic interest as it is now. But I've found that the more I've made my academic interest focus on what I'm just really genuinely interested in, which is all these neat, interesting, fascinating, crazy libertarian ideas, the more it's worked out for me. So it's been really an amazing experience.
Well, actually, you raise a very interesting topic. It is a problem that every graduate student faces. Everyone has his or her own sort of intense interest in something, right? But then sometimes you feel like, well, the academic life isn't only about following my interests around and my idiosyncratic, sort of loves. I have to do something that's professionally viable. It just so happens that those coincided for you. And that's
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it is true that you can't just do whatever you happen to be interested in. But I think a lot of times, when you're really genuinely interested in something, that shows through in your work. I mean, you come up with angles on the stuff that other people might not. Or you convey an enthusiasm and passion for the ideas, and that by itself goes a long way, even in the sterile world of academics.
Yeah, and academia needs specialists in idiosyncratic areas. I remember a friend of mine who got interested in the liturgy of Greek Orthodoxy, and it was like all he cared about. I thought, this is the most boring subject in the world, and you're probably the only person who knows about this stuff. But he was a philosopher, and he was able to match these things. It turns out now, within I guess in the world of political and moral philosophy, he is considered the great expert on the topic of, the liturgy of Greek Orthodoxy, so I guess it works out sometimes.
Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does. But one thing that academics don't do enough, I think, is think about themselves as entrepreneurs and think about themselves as producing a product that other people are going to consume. So you do have to take into account what you're good at and what you have a passion for. It matches up in certain ways with what you're good at, but you also have to think about what people want to read, what people are interested in, and allow that to shape the work that you produce, just like in any other business.
I'm very optimistic about your book as a consumer product. I mean, you were so gracious to send me a draft of probably, it seems like about 2/3 of it is finished now.
Yeah.
And I just devoured it because, I mean, it's something I really care about. Also, I think you add a different perspective than I've read before, and it's extremely enlightening. I suppose you had to kind of take into consideration what else was already written and figure out, how yours would fit into that into this niche market. Was that something you were thinking about, or did that so you just sort of naturally able to add this value?
It's funny. We didn't have to think about that as much as we might have thought that we would have to think about it, just because there isn't really any academic book that tries to give a kind of systematic history of libertarian thought in the way that we wanted to do, right? Sort of going back beyond the 1940s Rand Patterson era, right, to some of the earlier precursors of libertarian thought. And nobody was doing that. You got Brian Doherty's great book, which is a wonderful history of the libertarian movement in the United States, but that's a very different kind of thing from the sort of intellectual history that John Tomasi and I are trying to produce in our books. So we really felt lucky to kind of stumble into this project where the field was really wide open for us to do whatever we wanted to do.
And this is precisely what I love about your book the most. It stops treating libertarianism as something that was just sort of born out of nothing, in response to the New Deal, and starts to treat it as a long intellectual tradition. You mentioned a book. I think it came out in was it 1912, 1915, something like that, called Liberty and the Great Libertarians by
the name
is
Charles